Hear his word, Ramses, and obey.
Obey? Moses.
How on earth is someone who has a father that looks like this, a mother that looks like this, genetic testing of his parents that show that they are clearly sub-Saharan African, pictures and statues of him that look like this, how is it then that they are reported to have a mummy that looks like this? Well, it is simply because the famous mummy of Ramses II, whom they call Ramses the Great, the one on which the whole argument of a non-black ancient Egypt relies, the one that is brought forward over and over again by some untrustworthy European and Arab archaeologists, that mummy is simply fake. And we have the evidence to prove it, including genetics. Aside from the famous bust of Nefertiti, which we have already proven is a clear fake, see our previous video on this, this image of Ramses II would come in as one of the most famous images used in the context of ancient Egypt, the Nubio-Kemetic civilization. But you'll soon see that everything about this image is fraudulent, from the picture to the mummy itself. All of it, a massive fraud to try to insert an impostor into this black African lineage. Sargon of Akkad once said, "Sargon, the mighty king, king of a god am I, the black-headed people I ruled and governed." This is the Without History channel. Every episode, we bring salient facts about African ancient civilizations and history, and detail how these civilizations contributed to our modern world. We dive deep into what research has to say about the often overlooked or misattributed contributions of these key eras in our collective history. Every contribution, no matter how small, helps us eradicate ignorance of our heritage. Probably because Ramses is considered by many one of the greatest pharaohs in Egyptian history. And so, if one can claim Ramses as white or Levantine, then by distortion of logic, they would also claim the whole of ancient Egypt as non-black, the whole 3,000-year-long civilization. Never mind the unending list of black pharaohs from the beginning, when Narmer unified Kemet, to the pyramid-building phase when Khufu and Imhotep built pyramids and invented medicine, or when Hatshepsut made her expedition to Punt, or even during the Roman era, centuries after ancient Egypt, the Nubio-Kemetic civilization had ended, when the Romans themselves described all the ancient Egyptians, Kemetu, as black. Never mind Thutmose III, the one they call the Napoleon of Egypt, who expanded the empire well into the Levant, effectively creating one of the largest empires ever known to man. None of that would seem to be enough as long as one of the 300 pharaohs in Kemet can be proven as white or Arab. But before we dive into all the archaeological and genetic evidence that shows that Ramses II was clearly a black African, let's first look at this image of Ramses's mummy that we see everywhere online. In an insightful article from fakehistory.com that I will link below, the author clearly outlines the evidence against the famous image of Ramses II's mummy. A photo circulating widely across the internet has been falsely claimed to depict the mummified remains of Pharaoh Ramses II, sparking debates and confusion online. However, investigations have revealed that the image does not show the real mummy housed at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, but rather a cleverly crafted replica. Initially, the photo appeared convincing, bearing a striking resemblance to authentic images of Ramses II's mummy. Social media discussions, however, raised doubts about its authenticity, prompting a deeper look into its origins. Comparing the viral image to verified photographs of the real mummy proved challenging due to varying angles and lighting in available pictures. Yet, after locating a clear, confirmed image of the actual Ramses, the second mummy, subtle differences became apparent, enough to confirm that the widely shared photo was not genuine. Oh, by the way, did you know that in the 1960s, when the mummy of Ramses II had caught an infection in its leg, and that this infection was eating away at the mummy, the remains of the pharaoh had to be shipped to France for urgent radiation treatment. Well, the most famous Egyptologist of all time, Cheikh Anta Diop, was present when the mummy was brought to France, and he relates to us that when the mummy arrived in France, its skin was pitch black, as are pretty much all mummies from ancient Egypt. However, after repeated rounds of radiation to disinfect the mummy, its skin had turned considerably lighter, to the color that we see today. Its original skin was akin to that of his father's mummy, Seti I. You see what his father looks like? Extreme black skin, high cheekbones, flat nose, thin chin, and dolichocephaly. Well, remember this because we will also see what Ramses II's mum looks like later. Nevertheless, the replica, while clearly inspired by Ramses II, turned out to be an artificial creation. Questions arose about its purpose. Was it made for a museum display, an exhibit, a film prop, or simply for amusement? Despite extensive searches, the exact source remained elusive at first, leaving the mystery unsolved. This lack of clarity fueled online debates, with many still convinced of the image's authenticity. Complicating matters further, at least 3 separate attempts to digitally reconstruct Ramses II's living appearance had relied on this fake mummy, sparking heated arguments about historical accuracy based on a mistaken premise. The breakthrough came with help from the online community. A follower named Manissa traced the image back to a now-defunct website, Lubati Designs Unlimited, where the object was once sold as a latex prop. This discovery led to the prop's creator, Eric Lubati, a sculptor and mask maker since the 1980s. Lubati confirmed he crafted the life-sized Ramses II replica in the late 1990s, basing it on photos of the real mummy. Unaware of the controversy until recently contacted, he expressed amusement and pride that his work was mistaken for the genuine article. Only 10 to 15 of these props were ever sold, making it a rare item, and explaining why it went unrecognized for so long. The case of mistaken identity doesn't end with Ramses II. A similar mix-up has occurred with his father, Seti I. Photos of a replica of Seti I's mummy have also been mistaken for the real thing online. This replica, however, was easier to identify as part of the National Geographic Treasures of the Earth exhibit at the Children's Museum in Indianapolis. Clearly labeled and not intended to deceive, the exhibit piece contrasts with the genuine Seti I mummy, whose authentic appearance differs noticeably. But what did Ramses himself have to say about his own appearance? Well, that's what we will see next. There are 2 important murals that depict Pharaoh Ramses II riding on a chariot defeating his enemies. And these murals are very telling, because if you do not know history, and you do not know the context, and you would be forgiven for accepting the arguments brought forth by deniers of Kemet. Their argument goes as follows. In this famous mural of Ramses trampling over the Nubians, dishonest archaeologists would like to proclaim that Ramses is Arab because he has a lighter skin tone than the Nubians who he's fighting. Well, the funny thing is, if you pay close attention, you will notice that the Nubians are depicted with 2 skin hues, one very dark and the other one dark brown. This is where you should note that Ramses himself is depicted as having a dark brown complexion. Not light brown, not white tan, not Caucasian, and not white. Keep this in mind as we will come back to this in a few seconds when we look at the next mural. This color palette is completely in line with Black African skin hues, where, from the Igbos in Nigeria, and West Africans in general, we have light brown skin hues, to the Sudanese, Senegalese, and the Dinkas having generally dark brown to almost black skin color. But all the skin colors are very much so Black African, and Ramses clearly falls within those palettes. How is it possible that people bring the argument forward that he was an Arab and different from the Nubian, when he is depicted as having the same color as some of the Nubians that he's fighting? And if you think that this was done by mistake, well, then look at this one. Ramses also did another mural to celebrate his victory in the Battle of Kadesh. The Battle of Kadesh, sometimes called the First World War, featured one of the largest ever chariot battles. It was fought in 1275 BCE in present-day Syria between the Egyptians under Pharaoh Ramses II and the Hittites under King Muwatalli II, who were supported by 18 of their allied and vassal states. And what do we notice from this mural where Ramses is fighting the people in Syria? We notice that Ramses depicted himself as having a completely different skin color than those who live in Syria. So either Ramses is completely colorblind, and all the artists that he employed are themselves colorblind, or the more realistic option is that Pharaoh differentiated himself clearly from those who lived in Syria because their skin is drawn as white. Even though they are Arabs, the skin is drawn as white. So in summary, with these two murals, the king tells us that number one, he is of the same phenotype as Africans as he has drawn on this mural, and number two, he is the farthest away from the Arab, let alone the Caucasian white. And yet today, you have a lot of Arabs who are using this very mural, to forward an argument that Ramses the Great was an Arab at best, or a Caucasian at laughter. Do you now see the complete comedy of having a king who did not want to associate himself with anything that had white skin color, as having a mummy that is white and that looks nothing like the Nubian and African? It is literally an insult to the intelligence of Ramses himself and the intelligence of anyone who has the capacity to observe. But then again, in this game of fooling the masses, the media has been used to great effect to pretend that that which is, was not. And this is exactly what they did with these famous fakes. In episode 40 of Without History, we saw how ancient Egyptian artifacts are plagued with fakes and forgeries. Interestingly enough, these fakes all seem to have a common objective: to introduce a Caucasian or Arab presence instead of the black man and the black woman in ancient Egypt. And in the most famous of those cases, as we have seen, the attempts are crude and laughable. Princess and Queen Tetisheri's statue is a clear fake that was used to train generations of Egyptologists before it was confirmed as a fake. These statues of Rahotep and Nofret are the strongest argument used by Arabs to say that ancient Egypt was a Levantine civilization, and yet these are obvious fakes of poor quality, where none of the artistic standards of ancient Kemet are followed. Queen Nefertiti herself, her bust being the face of ancient Egypt, has been proven to be a fake where its authors have admitted to the crime. I bring this up because many consider these statues and artwork as 100% authentic. They even use these as arguments to support a non-African ownership of ancient Egypt. And yet, when you look at other depictions of Nefertiti, you quickly realize that the bust is in opposition to what the royal artists portrayed of the queen. In the case of Ramses, the same applies. Throughout his whole life, Ramses had numerous depictions laid out throughout the empire, and they are all consistent. Very dark brown skin, as we have seen, is not uncommon in black African people and is in fact the skin type of black Africans, with facial features indistinguishable from those of black Africa. This makes sense because, as we will see next, both his parents carried the exact same phenotype as him. On his murals, you can see that he has the same phenotype as the Nubians. In one of the largest statues in ancient Egypt, one of those that have survived almost intact, Ramses's features are again consistent. Look at the generous lips, the protruding jaw, the high cheekbones, large eye sockets, the thin chin, the broad shoulders and small waist, the long limbs, so on and so forth. His features are even more evident in this lesser-known statue of him, and you can see why this statue of him is not so popular. because you can clearly make out that he cannot be mistaken for anything else. He is clearly a black man, and this lifelike statue looks nothing like the reconstructions that we see online. Or again, as we can see here on the Abu Simbel temple, with the giant statues which are done at the entrance, they have features which are uniquely black, even after its relocation and multiple rounds of restoration, which we know is a code word for defacement and transformation away from African features. So when we compare the statue of Ramses II with this reconstruction of Ramses II, one being done by an artist who was living during the time of the pharaoh and was commissioned by the pharaoh, and the other being done 3,500 years later by people who came to the region in 600 AD, you can clearly see the motives are to reappropriate the identity of this most successful of pharaohs to a group that happens to have only recently arrived in the northern part of the region. And you can now understand how the current mummy of Ramses is either a fraud or a misattribution, or an intentional defacement to make him appear white or Arab. But since they will not allow genetic testing of Ramses II, and since they did not want to allow Cheikh Anta Diop to test his melanin concentration, even after the radiation treatment, we have no option but to turn to those who gave him birth. And here too you will see that the evidence is in line with his contemporary depictions. Ramses II was son to Seti I and Lady Tua. His father was a brilliant military strategist who extended the empire well into the Levant and was the first to capture the city of Kadesh, although the city was later lost, giving his son an opportunity to recapture it. Seti also had to work hard to restore the reign of the god Amun after Akhenaten caused disruption in the Egyptian pantheon with his attempt at monotheism. Seti was not of royal lineage, but his father worked his way to power after supporting Horemheb, who had stabilized the nation after Akhenaten's downfall. Interestingly enough, no genetic studies have been done on the mummy of Pharaoh Seti. Nevertheless, this is what he looked like. And here is another one of his depictions, this time as a statue. You can see, even though it has been broken exactly at his nose, the shape of the head and the mouth and lips are definitely black African. So Seti's mummy is black, his skin is drawn as that of black people, his phenotype is sculpted as black. Okay, so Ramses' father was definitely black. What of his mother then? Oh, by the way, leave a comment if you want me to do an episode on the military campaigns of Ramses and his father, both of them military geniuses in their own rights, and the important role that his mother, Queen Tuya, played in shaping that period of Kemet. Tuya, Ramses' mum, is equally as fascinating. Also not of noble birth, she comes from a powerful military family, just like her husband Seti I. One of my all-time favorite masks is that of Lady Tuya. These burial masks are usually of neutral expression. Hers is almost jovial. And I love that the artist preserved her braids as a crown, as convention dictated. But you must be thinking, hey, without history, it is hard to tell what ethnicity she is from that mask. And I agree. It so happens that we have the DNA tests from Lady Tuya, and as you can see from this table, just like multiple famous ancient Egyptian mummies who actually had their DNA tested, Ramses II's mother had a 93% sub-Saharan African DNA result. In other words, unmistakably black. As I said at the beginning of the video, how on earth is someone that has a dad that looks like this, a mum that looks like this, pictures of him that look like this, reported to have a mummy that looks like this? His father was pure black African. His mother was pure black African. His depictions are identical to those of the Nubians, and in opposition to those of the Levantine. Ramses II cannot be mistaken for a white man with blue eyes, and even if he happens to have been albino, then it still wouldn't have matched the depiction that he commissioned of himself. Okay then, so maybe the mummy of Ramses II may not really be the mummy of the pharaoh. And this is exactly what we are going to see next. The mummy was labeled as Ramses II, based on hieratic inscriptions on its linen wrappings, and the coffin, which referenced his royal titles. However, these inscriptions were added during the mummy's reburial in the Cache, 21st dynasty, centuries after his death, 13th century BCE, raising questions about reliability. In addition, the mummy was not found in Ramses II's original tomb, KV7 in the Valley of the Kings, but in a secondary cache. No contemporary inscriptions or artifacts directly link the body to Ramses II. The mummy believed to be Ramses II was found in a cache of royal mummies in the Deir el-Bahari complex, specifically tomb TT320, also known as DB320. This tomb was a hiding place created by Egyptian priests during the 21st dynasty to protect royal remains from tomb robbers, who were becoming increasingly prevalent. The discovery was a bit convoluted and involved a family of local tomb robbers, the Abd el-Rasuls. In the early 1870s, the Abd el-Rasul family secretly knew of the tomb's location and had been discreetly selling artifacts from it for years. A decade later, in 1881, the Egyptian Antiquities Service, alerted by the appearance of royal artifacts on the black market, began an investigation. They eventually tracked the source to the Abd el-Rasul family. Under questioning, and reportedly some pressure, one of the brothers, Mohammed Ahmed Abd el-Rasul, revealed the location of the tomb. Émile Brugsch, working for the Antiquities Service, was the first Egyptologist to enter TT320. He found a chaotic jumble of royal mummies, including those of Ramses II, Seti I, Thutmose III, and many others. It was a truly astonishing find. This is where it gets interesting, and where you'll find arguments challenging the absolute certainty of the identification. The primary evidence for the identification comes from the following. Ramses II's mummy's coffin and his wrappings bore the royal cartouches, identifying him as Ramses II. So, if the grave robbers hadn't swapped mummies, and if Émile Brugsch hadn't tampered with or swapped the mummy, then we are to understand that this is indeed the mummy of Ramses. And why do I say that? It is because of the way the mummy was discovered. It involves parties that have been known not to be trusted and to have supported obviously fake Egyptian artifacts, namely, the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities. The discovery of the mummy of Ramses II is tied to the uncovering of the royal cache at Deir el-Bahari in 1881, initiated by an investigation led by Gaston Maspero. The cache, as we have mentioned, was initially discovered by locals, specifically the Abd el-Rasul family, who were identified as tomb robbers. Émile Brugsch was dispatched to the site to claim the mummies for the Egyptian Antiquities Service. He supervised their removal within 48 hours, a process that did not include recording the tomb's plan, which has been a point of contention. This extreme haste at which the cache containing multiple high-profile mummies was removed is absolutely unprofessional and indicative of foul play. Just to put this into context, the excavation of the tomb of King Tut took nearly a decade, and that's for one royal mummy. And in this cache, we had approximately 50 royal mummies. They completed this work quickly enough so that other Egyptologists of trusted acumen could not look into what they had done. I understand that there was an urgency to move the mummies from the cache, but that process was absolutely mishandled and heavily criticized by contemporary Egyptologists. In fact, Gaston Maspero, Brugsch's superior and the head of the Egyptian Antiquities Service in 1881, was on leave during the cache's clearance. Upon returning, he supervised the unwrapping of the mummies in 1886, suggesting a need to rectify or thoroughly document what Brugsch had hastily removed. In 2015, Dylan Bickerstaff, a modern Egyptologist, thought that Brugsch's decision to empty the royal cache in 48 hours without sketching the tomb or noting the positions of coffins had left Egyptology with more questions than answers about this invaluable find. Beyond this fiasco of the discovery and securing of the alleged mummy of Ramses II, there is another important event that could have potentially affected the identity of the mummy. The 21st dynasty priests rewrapped many of the mummies and sometimes placed them in different coffins. This raises the slim possibility of misidentification during the reburial process. However, the priests were generally very careful about maintaining the identities of the pharaohs, as they were still considered divine figures. It's unlikely they'd make a careless mistake with a pharaoh as prominent as Ramses II. While we know the priests moved the mummies, there aren't detailed surviving records specifically describing the transfer of Ramses II's body to TT320. This is a gap in the evidence, but not unexpected given the clandestine nature of the operation. Some have posited that the mummy could be a later, less important individual placed in Ramses II's coffin. There is also a more logical explanation. Because tomb robbers had raided the tomb of Ramses II, they probably interfered with the decomposition process of the true mummy. Or worse yet, they stole the mummy of the king, which would have been adorned with jewelry and believed to have carried the favors of the gods. In order to preserve the dignity of the crown, the pharaoh, who would have discovered the tomb empty, would have sacrificed one of the Syrian captives and replaced the body of the king. And if you are thinking that this explanation is crazy, I would totally agree with you. But it would be infinitely more probable that the current narrative. And to close the whole argument, there is a simple fix. Complete the DNA test of Ramses II's mummy, complete his melanin concentration test, like Sheikh Anta Diop also wanted, and then compare those results with the DNA data that we have of his mother. It would be very easy to tell if the current mummy of Ramses is authentic. Until then, my hypothesis of the mummy of Ramses II being a fraud will stand, as more probable that the accepted fairy tale. Critics argue that labels added during the 21st dynasty reburial could be erroneous or politically motivated, and we know that other mummies in DB320, like Thutmose I, were misidentified due to relabeling. The mummy of Thutmose I was later shown to belong to a younger man, suggesting misattribution. So it is not impossible that Ramses II's body was indeed switched. What I do know for sure is that when Ramses was alive, this is how he asked to be drawn, and this is how he asked to be sculpted, as a black man. And this fact is completely ignored by a community who would like to hold on to fantasy, a community that has been proven to advance fakes in order to give their lie of a non-black Egypt a chance. And, like I have mentioned before, the whole of Kemet, from the pre-dynastic era in 3500 BC to its downfall in the second half of the last millennium BC, during that whole time, ancient Egypt was black and looked like this. And out of all the 300+ pharaohs that I have studied, none look Arab or white in their contemporary depictions, and Ramses II is no exception. So no, Ramses looked nothing like this. He would have been shocked at the idea that someone would paint him as a white man or a Levantine. Don't forget to add this video to your favorites so you can reference it later in discussions with Kemet deniers. Look at you, not even subscribed. Shame on you. Shame. Don't miss our previous episode on how fake artifacts are trying to change African history. Join us and see how those who are said to be without history birthed civilization itself.